Hello everyone, it's Richard here again with my the fifth and final chapter of the critical book by Dr. Grace Patterson. Again, it's my readings, not the whole thing, so an abridged version in other words. I hope you can hear me. I'll try to speak clearly. So the fifth chapter is the solution. The situation in the NHS cannot continue like this. Things are deteriorating all the time. We can track the deterioration through the monthly statistics, which reveal just how badly NHS is falling on its targets. How long it is taking ambulances to reach patients who are experiencing life-threatening emergencies now. How many people each month wait for more than 12 hours to be admitted to a hospital ward after they've been assessed in A&E. What proportion of patients are treated within the A&E within the 4-hour target. And then there's a waiting list, of course, which are extraordinarily long. This government has said in early 2023 that waiting lists are a top priority, but we're yet to see any meaningful change. And beyond the numbers, the statistics are that there are people. Every one of those numbers represents a patient who's been failed. So many cannot access what they need from the NHS in a timely manner because of the decisions of politicians. This is awful to contemplate, and it is equally awful to realise the impact of all this on the staff. They still continue to go to work day after day, attempting to keep patients as safe as they can, often in impossible circumstances, without adequate support. The NHS wasn't meant to be like this. It shouldn't be like this. Thankfully, people are becoming more aware of the situation all the time, so we have an opportunity to push back. But we need to get organised, be clear about what we want to change, and mobilise an enormous number of people to speak up. There's no time to lose. Our primary concern, of course, comes down to demand and the inability of the NHS to currently cope with the healthcare needs of the population. The health service needs to be invested in, strengthened to meet the needs of the public. But our concerns also relate to the way the system has been restructured over decades by politicians. The current existence of many private healthcare companies running NHS services all over England. Because it looks as though NHS campaigners have been correct for 6 years, the infiltration of private companies has now been linked to a negative impact on patient care. Yeah, I know. In June 2022, a study came out in one of the more respected medical publications in the world, The Lancet. The study, an observational one and the first of its kind, had focused on NHS services being run by private healthcare companies between 2013 and 2020. It found that the privatisation of NHS services in England over the past 7 years has been linked to a decline in the quality of patient care. It also identified that increased rates of private outsourcing were associated with significantly increased rates of treatable mortality. In other words, private outsourcing within the NHS was linked to deaths that could have been avoidable with effective healthcare. This study Conversations around charging within the NHS aren't new. The Conservative government took steps to scrutinise those accessing healthcare some years ago. As the campaign group Docs Not Cops explains on its website, on Monday 23rd October 2017, NHS England introduced regulations requiring ID checks for all patients accessing most secondary non-emergency care. This includes but not is limited to maternity, antenatal care, paediatrics, children and cancer treatment. Trusts are forced to charge upfront to those who cannot provide ID to prove their eligibility for NHS treatment. These regulations follow the introduction of a health surcharge paid on top of visa application fees. but the conversations are gathering pace and becoming more prominent. More recently, we have seen senior politicians directly stating that they would like to see changes involving patients paying for services. Rishi Sunak, with his pledge currently on hold to charge patients for missed NHS appointments, and Sajid Javid, who has stated in a piece in the Times that he thinks NHS patients should be paying for GP appointments and any attendances. Their rhetoric is ramping up. If the politicians get away with charging patients in this way, just as they got away with numerous previous reforms that have pulled the NHS away from these original principles, it mark a total breakaway from the NHS constitution. NHS privatisation will go beyond the outsourcing of services, the buying up of GP practices, and the selling off of NHS buildings. It would truly spell the end for the NHS as we know it. Politicians have chosen to show their cards regarding the NHS. The Conservative Party in speaking about charging patients, and the Labour Party in talking about their hopes to utilise the private sector in supporting the NHS to recover. From what I'm seeing online, the thousands of people who I'm speaking to, this isn't what the public wants. There is the sense that energy is building now, building to push back en masse. The NHS was set up as a bold, progressive project, aiming to create equal healthcare that is comprehensive and free at the point of use. These are always ambitious goals, and they are always going to involve a constant reimagining of what the public needed. But these goals are never seen more ambitious than right now, when staff in many places are unable to provide patients even with basic care. The long-term aim must be to fully attain these goals, to create a situation where the three core principles are central to decision-making, and the NHS is able to take greater strides towards breaking down structural barriers within our society and offering everyone the care they need. Right now, we must demand that the work begins to rebuild our NHS, shore it up, and strengthen both the infrastructure and the NHS workforce immediately, both to safeguard lives in the short term and to build sustainability within the public service. The first and most obvious thing we could be doing to improve things will be to support staff. NHS staff are the backbone of the service. They keep it running, yet they're being wholly unsupported, which is causing more and more of them to leave. Staff across the board need to be given a substantial and immediate pay rise, both to restore the real-term pay cuts that have been made over the past 13 years and to address the imbalance between healthcare workers' wages paid in the UK and those paid in other countries that are comparable from an economic standpoint. Hospital consultants in Ireland are now paid around 3 times as much as NHS consultant doctors, and this situation plays out in many other countries too. Working conditions for healthcare workers abroad are better in some ways too. Lower number of hours, more time to rest, support with training budgets, allowing the workforce to keep up to date with the latest knowledge easily. All of these things support a workforce, and the NHS has been falling behind in other countries on them for many years now. It's not all about money. Staff have enjoyed so much and continue to do so, working in a system under huge pressure before the pandemic, through the pandemic and beyond. There are some fantastic projects and charities that support NHS workers with mental health support, but these need to be expanded and made more accessible to any staff member who needs support. Even when things are normal, working in healthcare is intense. There are sights you see and things you experience that become normalised, even though they aren't normal at all. They can be traumatic and they stay with healthcare workers. We need to do a much better job of caring for our workforce, because that after all, if we're not caring for the staff, how can we expect them to be able to care well for their patients? I speak to NHS staff every day about their experiences working in the NHS. I'm just checking my notes here. I speak to NHS staff every day about their experiences working within NHS, and when they talk to me about what's really getting them down, keeping them awake at night through worry, it's issues relating to their patients and their colleagues. There is an incredible culture within the NHS, a culture of teamwork and responsibility, with countless people dedicated to doing the best they can for patients. But this culture has been taken advantage of in recent years. Staff have been expected to give more and more of themselves simply to keep the service going. It's not safe and it's not sustainable. Healthcare workers are trained to work well under pressure, and periods of heightened activity are expected by the staff, but the pressure simply never let up now. I speak to a lot of frontline doctors about what is happening in both their professional and their personal lives, and as I write this, I've had 2 emails from the past 24 hours from different doctors working in different specialities, both telling me that the stress and mental exhaustion associated with their jobs have led to depression and suicidal ideation in the past 6 months. And if it wasn't for support, which they were forced to pay for privately, they think they would have taken their own lives. It requires a lot for anyone to admit that to another person, and because the NHS values quality of resilience and strength and simply putting up with the things, it can be very difficult to acknowledge how bad things have got. I've heard from both these doctors because now that they are recovering, they're determined to speak up and ensure that other doctors are not placed in the same position as them. And so our first priority, our immediate priority, is the staff, supporting the current workforce and attracting new members to strengthen the NHS at this time of crisis. Crucially, in all of this, the government needs to stop treating staff as commodities, taking every last ounce of energy from them, failing to show appreciation, expecting them to sacrifice more and more for less and less. We need to value staff, who are a group of highly trained professionals they are so lucky to have. Their skills and expertise are incredibly valuable, and they are workers. They deserve to be valued and paid properly, just like all workers. Beyond supporting and building the NHS workforce, there are a number of other areas which immediate action could and should be taken to strengthen the NHS in the immediate future. The first is to urgently address the lack of capital investment in the service, which is why many of the NHS buildings are in such bad shape. No public health care system should be operating with crumbling buildings, leaking roofs and other problems, some of which have been deemed to carry a significant risk to staff and patients alike. The maintenance bill for unmet repairs in the NHS in England was £9 billion in June 2022, and this figure has been growing fast. The government has somehow managed to disregard the problems and failed to take responsibility. This needs to be addressed as a matter of urgency. A flash poll of health leaders ran by the NHS Confederation in June 2022 showed the scale of the current problems. The organisation explained at the time NHS leaders warn of ageing buildings, run-down estate and outdated computer systems which are risking patient safety. A provider trust chair had observed, the standard of much of our office accommodation and its IT is miles behind the rest of the economy. There are constant problems with blocked toilets, and our changing rooms and rest areas for staff are cramped and lack privacy. We are also not building up our capacity to deal with waiting lists, and the conditions for patients in these sub-wards and clinics are not fit for purpose. The problems are happening all over. If we want the NHS to be able to function safely, the government needs to start investing in these basic things fast. They have been neglected for far too long, and the situation is contributing to patient safety problems now. Alongside the maintenance upkeep, NHS PFI debt needs to be urgently paid off. Because of the PFI contracts that were entered into many years ago, some NHS trusts are in staggering amounts of debt, and it is affecting their financial stability. As The Guardian reported in October 2022, hospital groups spent £2.3 billion on legacy PFI projects in 2020 to 21, of which just under £1 billion went on costs for essential services such as cleaning and maintenance. A third of the remaining PFI spend, £475 million, went purely on paying off interest charges. The situation is perfectly summed up by David Rowland for the Centre of Health and the Public Interest, who stated in that piece. For those trusts with the PFI hospital, the high cost of these schemes will continue to be a major drain on their budgets. This is at a time when they are making planned cuts of £12 billion a year and expect to have to meet an additional £6 billion of costs next year due to inflation. Despite the pressure on NHS trusts to make cuts under the 25-year-long contract, PFI companies and their shareholders have been given a watertight guarantee that they will receive payments and a return on their investment. In short, expenditure on staff, equipment and other capital projects can be seen by a trust, but not their PFI payments. Cut by a trust. So in short, expenditure on staff, equipment and other capital projects can be cut by a trust, but not their PFI payments. In addition, under the PFI contracts, the NHS trusts, not the private companies, bear the risk of high inflation. Oh, do they? Which means that the payments to PFI companies may increase substantially as the retail price index rises. The rise in inflation will consequently not dent substantially, if at all, the profits of PFI companies. The situation is appalling. Some of the PFI contracts run almost to 2050, and despite repeated calls from campaigns in recent years to end the schemes and pay off the money, the government has ignored this. Surprise, surprise. We are in a situation that is financially scuppering some NHS trusts, who are forced to squeeze their spending in other areas in order to pay their PFI bills every year. This money could be put to better use, for example, improving things for patients. A conversation that seems to be missed when people talk about the fragmentation of our health service is the loss, amid this outsourcing, of the built knowledge and experience within the service itself. Many NHS staff aim to work within the service for many years or their entire career, and when you are working within the service, these people, the services they run, the processes they develop, the knowledge they bring to the work of the local population and their needs is unbelievably rich. The value of this cannot be underestimated. When a new provider comes in and wins a contract to run an NHS service, often they disrupt this built knowledge and the careful processes that have been developed over time by the NHS staff who understand their patient populations. It is a metric that goes unmeasured, but the loss is profound. Betty Churn. And when the ethos is competition, when providers are intent on pushing competitors out of the way and winning these NHS contracts, something else is lost too. The NHS was a service built on collaboration and shared learning. Outsourcing destroys this ethos. If a provider comes in and starts to build up its own processes, its own built knowledge of a population, then doesn't renew its contract, loses the contract to a competitor, or decides to extricate itself from one because it's not profitable for the company to continue, this built knowledge is lost. A healthcare system should be retaining the built knowledge of healthcare professionals working within their population. We should not be allowing this information to be lost only to be relearned by the next outsourced provider or the one after that. It is a waste, and the impact on how well patients are understood and ultimately the care they will receive from their local services. If we want the NHS to thrive for another 75 years and to achieve the aims it set out to fulfil, we need to eliminate outsourcing from the NHS. It must be stopped and reversed. Often when I was speaking about this out online, people point out that achieving this will take a lot of effort, work and time. First, I think they underestimate the current effort that is being expended as rendering contracts for these outsourced providers. The sheer administration involved in the rendering of NHS contracts creates a huge amount of work across the country. Work that we could have done away with if we invested in the idea that we want our public healthcare system to be publicly funded and run. And second, I don't think we should be intimidated by an ambitious plan to return the NHS to the structure and shape that it was intended at its inception. It has taken 4 long decades of politicians to implement the many changes that have brought us to where we are to now. It might take a while and a lot of effort to get back to the functioning we require, but the long-term benefits for the service and patients will be enormous, and it is the best way to ensure that NHS's viability, sustainability and progress for decades to come. There are so many challenges facing our society and, by the same way, facing the NHS, and we will be best placed to tackle these once the service has been brought back into full public ownership. Perhaps the most obvious of these is technology. As described above, due to a lack of capital investment over many years, the NHS has fallen behind on its tech investment. There is a huge disconnect at present between the level of technology that our society has developed and what staff are working with in the NHS. In terms of patient healthcare, the service has always been at the cutting edge of available science and medicine, which is a source of great pride for many people. But in terms of IT structures, it's essential to help services to run efficiently and so to aid communications between healthcare teams. We are lagging far behind. In the early 2000s, the Labour Party created a national programme for IT, which was intended to revolutionise the way the health service worked. But the project turned into utter chaos and a waste of taxpayer money to the tune of £10 billion. It's not just Tories making things up, Labour does as well. It was a disaster involving changing requirements, delays and technical challenges. The project ran years behind time and was eventually abandoned. And since then, politicians seem to have lost their ambitions regarding technology within the NHS. And speaking for what I know about IT, which is a whole career, it seems that in many cases, the Treasury cut the funding for the initial consultants wanted to do the groundwork, the foundations for the requirements and specifications. That funding was cut, so the basic ground was never laid correctly, hence the whole project was doomed from the outset. Mismanagement on a grand scale. And in thinking about key structures within the NHS that would need much needed investment, another obvious area is the NHS estate. The buildings that make up NHS facilities are a hodgepodge of buildings of different ages, some of which are older than the NHS itself and which were bought at the NHS's inception. Healthcare needs have changed enormously over the past 75 years. Scanning technology has changed enormously. Operating theatres have changed. Intensive care units did not used to exist. The setup of wards has changed, and as medical advances have occurred over the decades, there has been the need for more and more departments incorporating new and different equipment. When new buildings have been designed, planners and architects have tried at various junctures to design new structures in versatile ways, but many of the buildings are now poorly organised, and this has led to crowding, uncomfortable working environments and inefficiencies in delivering good care. Many of the buildings are also poorly ventilated or drafty or overheated. There is a running joke amongst NHS staff that there are 2 temperatures within NHS buildings, roasting to the point that staff are often forced over the windows to reduce the temperature because it gets so uncomfortable or freezing. This is energy inefficient and uncomfortable for the huge number of people, both staff and patients, who operate within the buildings. It is also irresponsible in 2023. Important questions are starting to be asked about the impact of the NHS on the climate emergency and the costly waste of energy within the service. Amid a cost of living crisis so extreme that many local areas are setting up warm banks and places where people go to escape their freezing homes, The management of energy within the NHS is becoming more and more pertinent. Staff have started to raise concerns about the situation. During the heatwave of 2022, I heard from a number who were forced into working in inhumane conditions, with temperatures in the office above 30 degrees C. This was hard enough for the staff because temperatures like this do not make it easy for people to concentrate. But it was even worse for the patients, many of whom, of course, would already have been feeling unwell. We were sent various examples of air conditioning units breaking, and in one A&E department, staff started fainting from the heat. It is undeniable that these necessary changes will be enormously costly. Investing in hospital buildings, paying off PFI debt, paying staff properly, building the technology we need, tackling the sustainability within the service, ending outsourcing and buying up the parts of the NHS that have already been sold off will be difficult and expensive, and will require some new legislation to be written. And beyond this, the investment needed to tackle structural barriers and rebuild a system whereby the full diversity of our society is reflected in NHS leadership and direction will be a huge investment. The money involved, the staggering sums, are difficult to estimate. The NHS still owes around £50 billion simply in PFI debts, and all of the above goals will be hugely expensive to enact, in part because so much has been neglected for so long. When ideas such as these are proposed by campaigners, the question of cost commonly comes up, and many conclude that such bold plans are no hope of being enacted, because we simply do not have the money as a country to pay for them. I am not an economist, and I'm not going to attempt to estimate the sums required to bring the NHS back to the level of functioning required. But to my mind, it is not a question of cost, it is one of priority. Polling of the public has consistently shown that it supports the continuation of the NHS. The health service also has a clear constitution that is currently failing to adhere to. We do not at present have a public healthcare system that is delivering comprehensive care to all. So the government has two options, because there is no mandate to continue along a trajectory that is causing the NHS to fail on its own principles. It must either accept that its plans are not working and embrace bold ideas for radical transformative change, and must hold a referendum regarding the abolition of the NHS constitution, which it is no longer adhering to. There are costs, of course, to not providing healthcare. The cost of real, as in bad health. The economy deterioration because people can't work so well and so forth. So there's real costs. They're not measured. It's like pollution isn't measured financially, but there's a cost. It's quite clear to my mind what the outcome of that referendum will be. The British public cares deeply about the NHS, and I highly doubt it would agree with getting rid of its constitution. So where does that leave us? It leaves us in the position of needing to find the money to rebuild the NHS. And I do not believe that this to be the hopeless situation that it is often framed to be. It is true that our public finances are in dire straits, but in the years following the Second World War, when the NHS was first started, the country was facing even bigger, more complex challenges, and the will of the populace won out. That traumatised post-war landscape, ravaged by war and with enormous financial challenges, is the landscape in which the NHS was built. It can be rebuilt again. Taxes for wealthy people may need to be raised. Other less important projects may have to be delayed or reined in to enable the NHS investment required. But what is more important to our society than the health of our nation and the well-being of every person? Nothing, to my mind. After all, the benefits of a healthy society span far, far beyond the individual benefits of any person's lack of illness. A healthy population can lead to a larger labour force, greater productivity, and a healthier economy. Right, in the end. I've been campaigning long enough to know that a lot of people will make all kinds of disparaging noises if you start to talk about care. They will attempt to undermine the notion that it matters. There are countless people, MPs, journalists and others, who believe that there is some better measure of healthcare outcomes, and that talking about care somehow misses the point and focuses on something gauzy and unimportant. Gauzy? But I absolutely disagree with that. Some patients require adequate, safe treatment that in terms of health outcome could be judged as sufficient, but didn't feel particularly caring to them. But if you want to be running an excellent healthcare system, one where people feel they have the time to explain things and feel heard, and staff have the space to listen, and patients have access to all the allied healthcare professionals to provide excellent treatment and a good recovery, that system will feel caring. So if you're going to push back against everything that politicians are doing, we need to bring the conversation back to care. Care is the most basic and most important element of our healthcare system. Patients and staff need to come together now. We are not in opposition. Everyone would be much happier if the service was being run excellently and there was enough care to go around. If we're going to fight, then, for the NHS, we need to ask a lot of people one very basic question, staff and patients. Do you think the NHS is caring for people properly? Anyone who says no is someone who will potentially take action to change things. Most people aren't sure of all the facts, but feel let down, and those people, despite some of them having absorbed unhelpful rhetoric from the media or from politicians, are seeking answers. The only way we are going to win this is if we can break down the barriers, start conversations, and talk to the many people who feel let down and have had their anger diverted away from the government. Every single member of the public deserves compassion right now, because every single person has been failed. The only thing that will stop the politicians' betrayal of the NHS is us. You and me and everyone who cares about the service and its future. We are living through extraordinary times, a time of political discord and chaos, of divisions and difficulties, where so many people don't have enough and have been let down in countless ways by a government that tries to get away with as much as it can, without scrutiny, without transparency, without accountability to the people it serves. But extraordinary times give rise to extraordinary ideas. The NHS was an extraordinary idea that came into being because a huge number of people believe that our society should be providing good care for every single person in their hour of need. That idea was transformative at the time, and that same idea has the power to improve lives and the health of our entire population today. We can rebuild the NHS, ending the private outsourcing, supporting the staff, fixing the problems, listening and learning and reimagining what our society needs from our public healthcare system. As William Beveridge said in his report in 1942, the report that helped give rise to the NHS in the first place, a revolutionary movement in the world's history is a time for moment in the world's history is a time for revolutions, not for patching. From this global pandemic, we face another revolutionary moment. It's not a time for more concessions, small changes, or compromises. It's time for the bold, transformative ideas that will help us to rebuild the NHS to thrive for the next 75 years. It's time to fight for the NHS. So again, thank you for your time, and thank you to Julia for writing the book. And please like and subscribe and spread this message far and wide by social media and talk to people and tell them what's going on and support the NHS whatever you can, and write to your MP, please. That'd be very useful indeed. Still works, still makes a difference. Bye.